Imagine for a moment that time itself could be poisoned, that certain days on the calendar were so fundamentally corrupted, so spiritually contaminated, that to work, to marry, to build, or even to begin a journey on them was to invite catastrophe into your life, not superstition, not folklore, but a structured, systematic belief enforced by priests, scholars, and monarchs across multiple civilizations who apparently knew something we have forgotten. These were the Egyptian dies nefasti, the Roman dies religiosi, the medieval Egyptian days, empty days, hollow days, days when the cosmic machinery ground to a halt and nothing, absolutely nothing, was to be attempted. But why? What knowledge did our ancestors possess about the fabric of time that we have lost? And more disturbingly, what happened to erase this understanding so completely that today we barely remember it existed? The ancient Egyptians maintained elaborate calendars that divided the year not merely by seasons or lunar cycles, but by the invisible currents of fate itself. Their priests, who doubled as astronomers, mathematicians, and keepers of sacred knowledge, identified specific days throughout the year, sometimes 24 or more, when the boundary between the ordered world and primordial chaos grew dangerously thin. On these days, temples closed their inner sanctums. Construction sites fell silent, markets emptied. The great stone quarries where teams of workers carved megalithic blocks with inexplicable precision stood abandoned. Even the Nile, that arterial highway of civilization, saw its traffic dramatically reduced as boats remained moored to their docks. The reasoning, according to fragmentary texts that survived the burning of the Library of Alexandria, was that these days commemorated cosmic battles, divine wounds, catastrophic upheavals in the celestial realm that somehow imprinted themselves onto the calendar like scars on skin. But here's where the mystery deepens into something far more unsettling. The Egyptians weren't alone. Across the Mediterranean, in Rome, an entirely separate civilization developed an almost identical system. The Romans called them dies nefasti, unlawful days, when legal proceedings could not be conducted, public assemblies could not convene, and marriages were strictly forbidden. How did two cultures, separated by vast distances and different pantheons of gods, arrive at the same conclusion about time's hidden structure? The Roman calendar, that intricate machine of days and months we still partially use today, contained layers of meaning that modern scholars treat as purely ceremonial, but examine the actual prohibitions more closely, and a different picture emerges. On dies nefasti, the formula nefas applied, meaning it was against divine law, literally not speakable, to engage in public business. The fasces, those bundles of rods symbolizing state authority, could not be displayed, courts closed, the machinery of empire simply stopped. Now consider the engineering required to maintain Rome itself, the aqueducts carrying millions of gallons daily across valleys on stone arches, the Cloaca Maxima sewage system, the Hippocaust heating systems beneath public baths, the complex harbor facilities at Ostia with their hydraulic concrete that still baffles modern engineers. All this infrastructure required constant maintenance, yet on certain days the work simply ceased. Were the Romans, pragmatic engineers who built an empire spanning 3 continents, really willing to risk infrastructure failure because of superstition? Or did they understand something about temporal cycles, about cosmic rhythms, that we have rationalized away into non-existence? The sources tell us that violating these prohibitions didn't just anger the gods, it invited disaster. Crops failed, buildings collapsed, ships sank, people died. The historical record contains numerous examples of Romans who ignored the calendar's warnings and paid catastrophic prices. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The system reached its most elaborate form in medieval Europe with the codification of the Egyptian days, dies Aegyptiaci, which were considered the most dangerous days of the entire year. Medieval manuscripts, painstakingly illuminated by monks who spent lifetimes copying ancient wisdom, preserved lists of these days with dire warnings. 2 days in each month, 24 throughout the year, when bloodletting could prove fatal, when starting construction would doom the building, when planting seeds would yield poison, when children born would be cursed or deformed. The prohibitions were specific and terrifying in their precision. Medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries, These weren't primitive documents, but sophisticated treatises incorporating Greek, Arabic, and Roman medical knowledge explicitly forbade surgery on Egyptian days. Physicians who violated this rule reportedly watched their patients die on the operating table with disturbing regularity. Agricultural manuals warned that seeds planted on these days would produce twisted, diseased crops. Legal documents record that contracts signed on Egyptian days were considered void, that oaths taken were not binding. Universities, those great centers of medieval learning, scheduled their academic calendars around these dates. The Cathedral of Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, the great Gothic cathedrals whose engineering still challenges modern understanding, all coordinated their construction schedules to avoid these empty days. Master masons, who commanded knowledge of geometry, proportion, and structural mechanics that allowed them to build stone structures soaring 300 feet into the air, structures that have survived centuries of wars, fires, and earthquakes, refused to lay foundation stones on Egyptian days. Why? What did they know? The official explanation, repeated in countless historical texts, is that medieval people were simply superstitious, that they inherited garbled versions of ancient Egyptian religious beliefs filtered through Roman paganism and Christian reinterpretation. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. The medieval period produced extraordinary technological achievements, mechanical clocks of staggering complexity, architectural innovations that wouldn't be matched until the modern era, agricultural systems that supported population densities not seen again until industrialization. These weren't ignorant peasants cowering before incomprehensible forces. These were sophisticated civilizations with advanced mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine. They built universities, hospitals, massive urban centers with complex infrastructure. They developed double-entry bookkeeping, advanced metallurgy, precision instrument making, and yet they all, across different regions and time periods, agreed that certain days were fundamentally unusable. The conspiracy of silence around this is remarkable. Modern historians treat Egyptian days as a curious footnote, a harmless superstition, yet fail to explain why this superstition persisted across multiple advanced civilizations for thousands of years, or why its abandonment coincides suspiciously with the historical period when so much knowledge was systematically destroyed, when libraries burned, when ancient texts were pulped for parchment, when entire civilizations collapsed and their wisdom vanished into darkness. Dig deeper into the medieval texts themselves, and you find something even more disturbing. The Egyptian days weren't random selections. They followed patterns, astronomical patterns connected to celestial configurations that medieval astronomers tracked with remarkable precision. Some manuscripts link them to the positions of Saturn and Mars, to conjunctions and oppositions that occurred on predictable cycles. Others connect them to lunar phases, to the calendar's relationship with solar years. There are hints, fragmentary but persistent, that these days marked moments when Earth passed through specific regions of space, when our planet's position in its orbit aligned with cosmic conditions that somehow affected terrestrial events. Modern astrologers might call this planetary influence, but the medieval understanding appears to have been more sophisticated, more mechanical, more predictive, more testable. They weren't consulting horoscopes. They were making calculations, precise mathematical calculations preserved in almanacs and ephemerides, coordinating their activities with cosmic clockwork whose mechanism we no longer comprehend. And the consequences of ignoring these calculations were documented in chronicles, in medical case histories, in legal disputes, in architectural disasters. Ships that sailed on Egyptian days and sank in calm waters. Buildings whose foundations cracked within days of being laid. Surgical patients who died despite textbook procedures. The evidence was apparently compelling enough that entire civilizations organized their activities around it for centuries. Now consider the larger context, the world these beliefs emerged from. Ancient Egypt, Rome, medieval Europe. These were periods of human history when architecture routinely exceeded anything we build today in scale and longevity. The Great Pyramid, aligned to celestial poles with precision that modern surveyors using laser equipment struggle to match, built from blocks weighing 70 tons each, lifted to heights of 400 feet, using techniques we still debate. Roman concrete structures that have survived 2 millennia, while modern concrete crumbles after decades. Gothic cathedrals built without steel reinforcement, without computer modeling, without modern materials, yet standing perfectly stable after 7 centuries. The engineering knowledge demonstrated by these structures is not primitive. It's sophisticated beyond our current understanding in many ways. These civilizations possess knowledge, practical, testable, reproducible knowledge that we have lost. And among that lost knowledge was apparently an understanding of time itself as a variable phenomenon, a structured medium with properties, with dangers, with optimal conditions for different activities. What if the empty days weren't superstition at all, but rather the remnant of a scientific understanding of temporal mechanics? What if our ancestors knew something about the nature of time, about its interaction with matter and energy, about windows and barriers in the cosmic order that our modern physics has yet to rediscover? The discontinuity is striking. For thousands of years, multiple advanced civilizations organized their activities around these temporal prohibitions. Then, quite suddenly in historical terms, the practice vanished. By the 17th century, Egyptian days had been largely abandoned throughout Europe. By the 18th century, they were curiosities mentioned only in antiquarian texts. By the 19th century, they had been forgotten entirely except by folklorists cataloging quaint peasant beliefs. This erasure coincides precisely with the period historians call the Enlightenment, when rationalism supposedly triumphed over superstition, when science replaced religion, when humanity finally emerged from darkness into light. But examine what else happened during this period. Ancient texts were systematically destroyed or locked away in private collections. Indigenous knowledge systems worldwide were eradicated as European colonialism spread. Traditional practices maintained for centuries were prohibited as backwards or pagan. The historical record was rewritten, standardized, sanitized. Alternative chronologies were suppressed. Archaeological evidence that didn't fit the approved narrative was ignored or explained away. And throughout this process, a remarkable amount of practical knowledge vanished. Metallurgical techniques, astronomical understanding, engineering methods, agricultural wisdom, medical treatments. The official story is that this knowledge was primitive and was rightfully replaced by superior modern methods. But the evidence suggests something more disturbing, that advanced knowledge was deliberately suppressed, that our civilization suffered an induced amnesia, that we are living in a dark age pretending to be enlightened. Look at the population dynamics of this transition period, and the darkness deepens further. The 17th and 18th centuries saw devastating plague outbreaks, wars of unprecedented brutality, colonial genocides, the deliberate destruction of entire cultures. City populations crashed, rural areas were depopulated. Traditional knowledge holders, the elderly, the skilled craftspeople, the keepers of oral traditions, died in massive numbers. And when populations recovered, they were different. Taller ancestors became shorter descendants. Robust constitutions became fragile ones. Long lifespans shrank. Multiple sources from the medieval period describe people, common people, not just nobility, living routinely into their 80s and 90s. Church records, cemetery data, chronicle accounts all suggest life expectancies far higher than the official histories claim. Then came the catastrophes of the early modern period, and something changed in the human stock itself. Genetic bottlenecks, degraded immune systems, lost vitality. It's as if humanity itself was somehow diminished, as if the survivors of this period were not quite the same species as their ancestors. And along with this biological reduction came a cognitive reduction. The ability to perceive and work with the hidden structures of reality, the temporal mechanics encoded in the Egyptian days system, simply vanished from human awareness. We became blind to dimensions of reality our ancestors navigated routinely. The architectural evidence is particularly damning. Throughout Europe, throughout the Americas, throughout Asia, we find cities built on cities, later structures erected atop earlier ones of manifestly superior construction. Ground floors become basements. First floors become ground floors. Street levels rise mysteriously by 10, 15, 20 feet. The official explanation is gradual accumulation of debris over centuries, but examine the physical evidence more carefully. In city after city you find the same pattern. Older structures of massive stone blocks, precision-fitted, built to last millennia, partially buried and then built over with cruder structures, using inferior techniques. Doorways buried to their halfway point. Windows converted to basement openings, buildings clearly designed for giants, 10-foot doorways, 15-foot ceilings in what are called ground floor rooms, now half submerged beneath street level, and everywhere inscriptions and dates that don't make sense. that placed these ancient structures in the 18th or early 19th century, in the period immediately after the supposed Enlightenment. What buried these buildings? The official histories are silent. Archaeologists talk vaguely about cultural layers but cannot explain the mechanisms. Theories about flooding, about mud floods, about catastrophic events that buried entire cities are dismissed as conspiracy theories despite the physical evidence visible in every old city center if you simply look with clear eyes. And then there are the orphanages. Throughout the 19th century, Europe and North America experienced a mysterious explosion of orphan children, millions of them. Vast institutional complexes were built to house them, massive stone structures, often repurposed from earlier buildings, filled with children who supposedly had no parents, no families, no histories. The official story blames disease, poverty, parental death, abandonment. But the numbers don't add up. Entire orphan trains crossed America, distributing children to families in the frontier territories. Orphanages in major cities held thousands of children simultaneously. Where did they all come from? Photographs from this period show something else strange. The orphans often appear well-nourished, well-dressed, sometimes better fed than the adults around them. They don't look like street urchins or children of poverty. They look like children from prosperous families who somehow lost their parents, their homes, their entire context. And this phenomenon coincides exactly with the period when cities were being rebuilt, when street levels were rising, when vast amounts of infrastructure were being constructed or reconstructed using techniques inferior to what came before. It's as if an entire population was somehow replaced, as if children appeared without parents to inherit and continue the knowledge systems of the previous generation. The genetic continuity, the transmission of wisdom from elder to youth, was broken, and in that breaking, the understanding of temporal mechanics, of empty days, of the hidden structure of reality, was lost. The medical records from the transition period contain their own disturbing patterns. Physicians in the 18th and early 19th centuries describe strange epidemics, mysterious diseases that don't match any modern diagnostic categories. Entire regions afflicted with wasting illnesses, with mental degradation, with conditions that sound more like radiation poisoning than anything in the pre-modern disease repertoire. Accounts of people developing symptoms when exposed to certain locations, certain buildings, certain objects from before the catastrophe period. Descriptions of inherited weaknesses, of families whose health deteriorated over generations, of bloodlines that simply died out. And meanwhile, the old medical knowledge, the sophisticated pharmacopoeia, the surgical techniques, the understanding of the body's subtle energies, vanished. Doctors in 1850 routinely bled patients and prescribed mercury, while their predecessors 3 centuries earlier had performed cataract surgery, understood antiseptic techniques, and compounded drugs of remarkable specificity. The trajectory isn't progress, it's regression. Knowledge was lost faster than it could be replaced. And among that lost knowledge was the medical understanding that made Egyptian days a matter of life and death, the comprehension of temporal influences on biological processes that we dismiss today as impossible despite overwhelming historical testimony. Consider the technology paradox more carefully. We're told that humanity advanced linearly from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowing. But the physical evidence shows something else entirely. The ancient world possessed concrete that self-repairs through bacterial action, that grows stronger over time. We use concrete that crumbles after 50 years. They built earthquake-proof structures using interlocking stones with no mortar. We build with steel and concrete that fails catastrophically. They created pigments and dyes that remain brilliant after millennia. Ours fade in decades. They produce steel of such quality that Damascus blades remain sharper than modern alternatives. Our steel corrodes and weakens. They erected obelisks weighing 500 tons, transported them hundreds of miles, and set them upright with precision we cannot duplicate. We struggle to lift 50-ton blocks with modern cranes. At every turn, when we examine actual capabilities rather than theoretical progress, we find that older civilizations could do things we cannot. The conventional explanation is that they had more time, more labor, more patience. But this explains nothing. Time, labor, and patience don't produce superior metallurgy. They don't create concrete formulas we cannot reverse engineer. They don't enable the precision cutting of granite blocks where modern diamond saws leave rougher edges. Something else was present. Knowledge, techniques, perhaps technologies that we have lost. And if we lost the ability to make superior concrete and steel, why shouldn't we have also lost the knowledge of temporal mechanics, of how to identify and avoid dangerous days? The chronology itself becomes suspect under close examination. The current historical timeline, the one taught in schools, published in textbooks, considered established fact, was largely codified in the 17th and 18th centuries, the same period when Egyptian days vanished from practice, the same period when cities were being buried and rebuilt, the same period when orphan populations exploded, the same period when population records become confused and contradictory. Scholars of that era, working in the newly established national libraries and museums, examined ancient texts and artifacts and declared them to be thousands of years old based on methods that seem remarkably arbitrary in retrospect. Dynastic lists were interpreted. Carbon dating hadn't been invented yet. Pottery typologies were established, and suddenly civilizations that might have been contemporaneous were separated by millennia. Technologies that might have represented a single advanced culture were distributed across centuries. A coherent picture of human development was replaced with a fragmented timeline full of mysterious dark ages, sudden collapses, lost knowledge, and discontinuous progress. What if this timeline is fundamentally wrong? What if the Egyptian, Roman, and medieval civilizations were not separated by thousands of years but were actually much closer, perhaps even overlapping, sharing knowledge and technology until a global catastrophe disrupted everything? The Egyptian day system would then make perfect sense, not as a superstition passed down through millennia, but as practical knowledge maintained across a shorter time span by civilizations in active contact with each other. The linguistic evidence supports this heretical chronology. Latin, ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian, we're told these languages evolved over millennia, that they're separated by vast chasms of time. But examine them more closely, and you find remarkable similarities, structural parallels that suggest much more recent divergence. Words that supposedly evolved independently turn out to have common roots. Grammar systems that allegedly developed in isolation show identical patterns. Writing systems thought to be unrelated share symbols and conventions. The official explanation involves elaborate theories of language families, proto-languages, migration patterns spreading linguistic influence over centuries. But a simpler explanation fits the evidence better. These languages weren't separated by millennia at all. They were contemporary variations, dialects of a more widespread linguistic system used by an interconnected global civilization. When that civilization collapsed, the unified language fragmented into the forms we now classify as ancient and distinct. The knowledge encoded in that original language, including the understanding of temporal mechanics, was lost in the fragmentation, preserved only in corrupted form by the scattered survivor populations who became our historical ancestors. And what caused the collapse? The sources hint at catastrophe, global catastrophe of a scale almost beyond imagination. Ancient texts from multiple cultures describe darkness, fire from the sky, the sun standing still, the earth shaking, mountains falling, seas rising, civilizations vanishing in days. We classify these as mythology, as religious allegory, as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. But what if they're eyewitness accounts? What if something happened, whether cosmic impact, solar event, geomagnetic catastrophe, or technology gone wrong, that devastated global civilization, that buried cities under mud and ash, that killed most of the population, that destroyed infrastructure and knowledge systems? The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have preserved fragments of the old wisdom. The Egyptian day system would be one such fragment, a remnant of more sophisticated temporal science, reduced to ritual prohibition without understanding, yet still carrying enough truth to remain practically useful for centuries. Until even this fragment was deliberately suppressed during the next round of catastrophe, the plagues and wars and social engineering of the 17th and 18th centuries that completed humanity's induced amnesia. The power structures of our current civilization have every reason to maintain this amnesia. If people understood that we're living in a diminished age, that our ancestors possessed capabilities we lack, that advanced civilizations rose and fell, leaving us as degraded inheritors of ruins, the implications would be revolutionary. The entire narrative of progress collapses. The authority of institutions claiming to represent the pinnacle of human achievement evaporates. People might start asking dangerous questions about what else has been hidden, what other knowledge has been suppressed, what other capabilities we might recover. They might start examining the ruins beneath our cities more carefully, the architectural anomalies, the technological artifacts that don't fit approved timelines. They might start questioning the chronology itself, the historical narrative that places our current civilization at the apex of human development. And once that questioning begins, the entire structure of manufactured history risks collapse. Better to keep people believing they're primitives who evolved from ignorance into enlightenment, that their ancestors were superstitious fools who feared empty days for no reason, that modern science has explained everything worth knowing, but the empty days themselves leave traces that resist erasure. In folklore, in folk calendars, maintained by rural communities, in agricultural traditions that persist despite official discouragement, we find the old prohibitions still practiced. Farmers in remote regions who still won't plant on certain dates, fishermen who avoid sailing on particular days. Builders who privately acknowledge that projects started at certain times face unusual difficulties. These practitioners aren't following superstition, they're following practical wisdom encoded in long experience, knowledge that worked even if the theoretical understanding behind it was lost. They're the living continuation of the Egyptian days tradition, maintaining through practice what official culture has tried to erase through denial. And their continued existence suggests something profound, that the temporal patterns identified by ancient science are real, that time genuinely possesses structure and variation that affects material processes, that our ancestors weren't primitive, but were in some ways more sophisticated than we are, more attuned to subtle realities that our reductionist worldview cannot accommodate. The question then becomes not whether the empty days were real, but what exactly made them empty. What property of time, what cosmic condition, what interaction between celestial mechanics and terrestrial processes created these windows of danger? The ancient sources speak of divine battles, of chaos threatening to break through cosmic order, of the gods wounded and weakened at particular moments in the cycle of the year. Strip away the mythological language and you find descriptions of periodic vulnerability, of regular intervals when normal causal relationships become unstable, when entropy accelerates, when the coherence that holds matter and energy in structured forms temporarily weakens. This sounds absurd to modern ears trained in mechanistic physics, but examine quantum mechanics, chaos theory, emergent complexity, and you find suggestions that reality is far stranger than classical physics imagined. Time isn't uniform, causality isn't simple. The fabric of space-time has structure, perhaps even periodic variations. What if our ancestors, through millennia of observation and testing, had mapped these variations? What if the Egyptian days system represented the applied science of temporal dynamics, knowledge we lost when civilization collapsed? The implications extend beyond mere historical curiosity. If the empty days were real, if time genuinely varies in ways that affect physical and biological processes, then our current civilization is navigating blind, ignoring patterns our ancestors understood and respected. We schedule surgery without regard for temporal factors that might affect outcomes. We plant crops based only on weather and soil, ignoring cosmic rhythms that could influence growth. We pour foundations and launch projects and start journeys without considering whether the temporal fabric itself is favorable or hostile to our endeavors. We've gained certain technological capabilities while losing others, and perhaps the knowledge we lost was more fundamental, more important to long-term survival and flourishing than the gadgets we gained. A civilization that understood time would be more capable, more stable, more aligned with reality itself than one that treats time as mere duration to be measured by clocks. And if such understanding allowed ancient civilizations to build structures and societies that lasted millennia, while ours seems poised to collapse after mere centuries, perhaps the ignorance isn't theirs but ours. The story of the empty days is ultimately the story of civilizational amnesia, of humanity forgetting what it once knew, of knowledge suppressed and wisdom lost. But it's also a story of persistence, of fragmentary memories that refuse to die completely, of practices that continue despite official denial, of evidence that remains visible to those willing to look. The buried buildings, the architectural anomalies, the technological capabilities of ancient peoples, the testimony of historical sources, the persistence of folk traditions, All these threads weave together into a tapestry depicting a past far stranger and more sophisticated than the approved narrative allows. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are survivors of catastrophe, inheritors of ruins, living among the bones of something greater. And the empty days, those hollow moments in time when our ancestors knew better than to act, stand as monuments to what we have forgotten, and warnings of what we might remember if we dare to question the comfortable lies we've been told about who we are and where we came from.